All right, in this video, I'm going to discuss the critiques of mind-body dualism. So in the last two videos, I discussed Plato's theory of the forms and Descartes' theory of the cogito, both of which involved a belief in a separation between the mind and the body. So just to refresh your memory, in Plato's philosophy, the idea is that the soul, the body is a kind of prison for the soul, and that the job of philosophy is to identify with the soul in order to be able to engage in philosophical activity and seek knowledge of the forms, which also I didn't mention in that video. Sometimes are also called the ideas. And then, the idea for Plato is that the body only provides us with imperfect representations of the form. So if we're trying to get knowledge by means of our senses, and even means of our reason, but attached to sensual representations, we're not going to have true knowledge of things. And so for Plato, the soul is primary, the body is kind of a punishment. And in Descartes, there's a similar assumption. The idea is somewhat different from Plato, but the idea is that our knowledge that we acquire through the use of the senses, which for Descartes are bodily, touch, vision, smell, and so forth and so on, is always doubtworthy, because it can cause us to be mistaken about things. And so Descartes' operation is to say that the only thing I can know with absolute certainty is that I'm thinking, because even if the entire world were an illusion, I would still know that I'm the one that's thinking. And so he says, therefore the soul is, and reason, the mind, is the starting point of philosophy, not the body. There is a certain implicit rejection of any kind of knowledge acquired by means of the senses, sense knowledge. So that's the idea. That's mind-body dualism. Now, there's a few things I want to add to this. Both of these philosophers fall into the philosophical camp known as idealism, and idealism is just simply the idea that, number one, the mind is primary over the body, or put it in other words, thought is primary over being. Being is everything that exists, both in the world, we're part of being as well, our body is part of being, it's what exists. And idealism says that the mind is nonetheless not part of being and is primary. And also that the world is more or less a representation of what's in my mind. And that ideas are what more or less produce the world. You know, in Plato's philosophy, the idea is that these formal abstract ideas, known as the forms, are what produce the world. That the world is a imperfect representation of these perfect forms. And so that's the idea. The idea of idealism is that thought determines being, that thought plays an important role in constituting being as it is. And it depends on this implicit division of the mind and the body. Okay, so what I want to look at are some criticisms from three different intellectual traditions: Feminist Theory, Post-Colonial Criticism, and Marxism. And each of these three have had a criticism of idealism and mind-body dualism that it produces. So first we'll look at the feminist critique. So some feminist writers, for example, Susan Bordeaux, who's a very good philosopher, has claimed that this division that many idealist philosophers have done of separating the mind and the body is false. Because, I should add something. Number one, the idea is that the body that's devalued in mind-body dualism is also the side of the emotions, our feelings. What Susan Bordeaux argues is that whenever we gain knowledge about the world, there is an emotional process that's involved in this. That one doesn't simply solely use abstract reasoning, but rather that this abstract reasoning is made possible through the emotional states in our body, and that actually our bodies play a tremendously important role in the construction of these abstract notions that the idealists like to privilege over everything else. That anytime we use rational thinking, we also use emotional thinking. There have been psychologists that have, used scientific methods to research this. But at a purely philosophical level, Susan Bordeaux argues that the emotions play a tremendously important role in the construction of knowledge, and that they give us a kind of basic representation of the world. Sometimes our most immediate knowledge that something is wrong in the world, or simply a judgment about something, comes through our internal emotional states, and that only later do we construct abstract concepts about that. But those abstract concepts are never done independently of the mind of the body. So that's the first critique. The second critique is that mind and body are one. The two aren't separated. In some ways, it's not necessarily a rejection of the notion of the soul or of the spirit, but it's the idea that this is something that's inseparable from the body, that the soul has no independent existence outside of the body, that the body is an important, very important element in all philosophical investigation. So what a lot of feminist writers have done is to try to show, create what's called an embodied approach to philosophy. Not one that's solely, in the realm of ideas and contemplation, but that's also very much about action and practice and doing things. Now, in terms of the feminist critique, some feminist writers, for example, Luce Irigaray, an important Belgian feminist, has also pointed out, has discovered a misogynistic and sexist set of ideas that are kind of unconsciously present in the writings of people like Plato and Descartes. And what they show is that historically, the mind-body dualists, the idealist philosophers, who have said that the body is a prison for the soul, and that the soul and the mind is what gives us knowledge, while the body keeps us in ignorance, have also gendered these things, and have tended to identify the body with femininity and the mind with masculinity. And by devaluing, what Irigaray says is that by devaluing the body, what many of these philosophers are also implicitly doing is devaluing the contributions of women and privileging those of men. And also saying that philosophy is a kind of masculine thing, and so forth and so on. And this is a very problematic thing to say, obviously, because it devalues both the contributions of women and privileges it to men. And that's been the critique. And the idea is that by criticizing mind-body dualism, you can also criticize ways that the kind of gendered structure in society has also operated to produce certain sexist and patriarchal notions. So that's the feminist critique. Now, a related one has been the Marxist critique. So Marxism is a set of philosophical and political ideas that come from the German writer and political activist Karl Marx in the 19th century. And what Marx was very interested in was the labor process. And Marx very strongly believed, contrary to idealism, that many of the ideas we have, the beliefs we have about the world, are produced through social processes. That everything from ethical and moral ideas we have to value judgments that we make, and even to some extent scientific notions, are the result of a historical process, which is related to a society's mode of production. And what Marx argues is that when Descartes and Plato, as well as some other mind-body dualists, when they separate the mind and the body, what they're essentially doing is also devaluing manual labor at the expense of intellectual labor. And there was a very great Marxist writer in the 20th century by the name of Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who's not that well known in intellectual circles because his writings have been hard to get hold of. What Sohn-Rethel argued was that the mind-body dualism is a reflection of the division of society into classes, social classes, which are understood as a relationship to the means of production. The idea in Marxism is that class isn't so much your income level or your power, but it's defined as a social relationship of production. So the working class are all the people who live by the sale of their labor power, their ability to work, essentially wage laborers and people who don't have anything else to offer but their ability to work. They can't really sell things to make a living. Whereas the capitalist class are all those people who buy the labor power of the working class and use that labor to get goods and services, which they then sell to get more value. And the idea in Marx was that the capitalists only pay the workers enough to sustain them while appropriating far more value than they produce. And so this then generates what Marx called a class struggle in society. And what Alfred Sohn-Rethel thought was that the division of intellectual and manual labor that we find in Descartes, but even earlier in ancient Greek philosophy in Plato, is a reflection of that class structure. So he thought that when Descartes said that the body and sensation doesn't give us access to any true knowledge, it more or less is the site of error, he was essentially thinking about manual labor. And he was identifying the manual laborer with the body unconsciously. And the idea is society is a kind of unconscious. We encounter it through our daily activity. And by devaluing the body, Descartes was also devaluing manual labor. Factory workers, ship workers, any kind of working person that does manual labor, farm laborers, and in the process of doing that, subordinating them to the intellectual labor of the capitalist. And the idea that Alfred Sohn-Rethel had was that this intellectual point of the mind that he privileges, because Descartes says the mind is the only thing I can know for certain, and everything that's acquired with the power of reason gives me access to true knowledge. What Alfred Sohn-Rethel says is that this is just a reflection of the class standpoint of the capitalist, and by subordinating the body to the mind, and by more or less viewing the mind as something superior, Descartes has unconsciously reproduced the class structure of early capitalist societies which he was living in. And that the idealists who privilege the mind over the body are essentially privileging the capitalists over the working class. Because the idea is the capitalist doesn't engage in manual labor. They have a managerial role. They invest their capital, but they don't work. And they don't engage in actual manual labor. So this was the idea of Sohn-Rethel, and his idea was that the mind-body dualism is very much a reflection of capitalist ideology. So this is the Marxist standpoint. And a third related notion in the critique of mind-body dualism comes from what's called Post-Colonial Studies. And one of the main theorists of this is a guy by the name of Frantz Fanon, who didn't produce necessarily a really detailed account of the mind-body dualism binary, but pointed out how this kind of idealist notion is a reflection of the colonial project of many European countries. So just to give you a little historical background, Descartes in the 17th century, although he was French, he was living in the Netherlands. And at that time, the Netherlands was one of the largest main capitalist countries in Europe. It was one of the most advanced ones. And it was engaging in a kind of colonial conquest of many parts of the world. South Africa, for example, Indonesia later. It was seeking to expand its control over the world in order to get cheap labor and sites of profitable investment. And what Fanon argues is that in colonial ideology, the colonial past, the colonized people were always viewed as people who lived by the body, weren't capable of engaging in intellectual activity, and were uncivilized. All this kind of ideas, which he pointed out as very, very problematic. The idea was that the colonizers are equipped with reason and with the intellectual abilities, and that through colonization they are able to advance the colonized subjects and raise them on a higher intellectual plane. Historically, this kind of way of thinking has been prominent in racist ideology, which views the victims of racism in exactly this way. I mean, as passive, and those who are being viewed as superior as active. And so, what Fanon argues is that although Descartes wasn't saying any of this in his text, he was internalizing the colonial as well as the capitalist ideology of the social formation in which he lived. And he was kind of generalizing this as a principle of philosophy. He was taking the colonial standpoint. He was taking the standpoint of the Dutch colonialist who views themselves as intellectually superior to the rest of the world, and enacts this through the act of colonization. Those are the three main critiques, and I think these critiques all point to something which is true. I mean, you don't have to agree with any of these critiques, but they point to something that I think is true, and that is that the separation of the mind and the body is something very problematic, because it privileges the mind over the body, and it assumes that the mind, intellectual activities are superior to everything else. That bodily activities and just everyday things that people do for fun and for pleasure are somehow inferior. It introduces a kind of superior inferiority ideology into philosophy. And whether or not the Marxist critique is correct, that it's a reflection of class divisions, or the Feminist Critique, that it's a reflection of patriarchal ideology, or the Post-Colonial Critique, that this is a reflection of the colonial ideology, they all highlight that there is definitely something wrong and problematic about this, and that we can make a great progress in philosophy by going beyond this mind-body dualism, and trying to find ways to connect the two, to say that, of course, intellectual activity is very important, but that it should be something in the world. It should be something worldly. That philosophy doesn't have to be so abstract and so speculative that it loses track of the world, or that it privileges intellectual activity over everything else, but rather that philosophy can be something that intervenes in the world in order to change it. I mean, this to quote Karl Marx, who we mentioned a moment ago. Marx once said, "The philosophers of hitherto have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it." And I think Marx is very correct here, because this is exactly what this critique of mind-body dualism is seeking to do. Is it's saying that philosophy should contribute something. Why would you just want to sit around and think about pure abstractions that have no relationship to anything real in the world? And so this brings me to a few concluding statements about the nature of philosophy and what we can learn through the study of people like Plato and Descartes, and to some extent to learn what not to do. And so here's the conclusion, is that philosophy can demonstrate how that what we perceive to be true is often not true, and it can equip us with a set of intellectual tools that we can use to think more critically about the world we live in. So that we don't just mindlessly go about believing everything we read on Twitter or in the news, but that we think critically. At the same time, this doesn't mean we become skeptics, that we just don't believe anything at all. But what it means is that we introduce a certain abstract, conceptual set of notions into philosophical activity. That philosophy is an intervention in the world. That what we perceive to be a problem, we perceive certain issues, we perceive certain things. These things themselves are called into question. And that in the process of engaging in this kind of questioning, we produce new kind of truths, new notions. So that's the first thing. Philosophy is an intervention. And number two, philosophy is concerned with truth. But not a kind of truth that is separated from the world, but a truthfulness about the very process of thinking itself. And I want to point something out now. In the 1970s, there was a very great French theorist by the name of Louis Althusser. And Althusser claimed that what philosophy should seek and aspire to do is to aid the scientists and to aid political thinkers, and to try to highlight how, for example, you have like all sorts of very complicated scientific disciplines today, from neurology to physics to quantum physics to biology, evolutionary biology. All of these disciplines assume certain philosophical notions that they rely on in order to conduct their activities. Right? They assume certain things about what we can know. Right? When a medical scientist, when the World Health Organization claims to know something about coronavirus, it's because they've done a lot of research, they've done a lot of testing. They don't necessarily claim that it's certain. Most of the time, science of all sorts and medicine progresses through the uncertainties and the openness. What philosophy does is it tries to show, how can we know? What can we know? When a medical scientist says that such and such is the case about coronavirus, how do we know that that's true? And philosophy gives us the critical abilities to both trust science while at the same time aiding science. To not engage in this kind of anti-scientific skepticism that's proliferating today on the internet and in society, but rather to aid people so that they can actually trust science more, so that they can understand how we come to know something and how it is that a scientist can tell us that such and such is the case, and you should take this vaccine because scientists have demonstrated that it can prevent the further spread of coronavirus, or it can contain it. Now, just to come to a conclusion, philosophy and science are two totally separate things. Philosophers do not engage in science at all. That's not what philosophy does. But it nonetheless can aid the scientists in providing them with a stronger conceptual foundation and theory of knowledge for the activity that they're involved in. So that's what philosophy is, and the conclusion is derived from this critique of mind-body dualism, which many people have pointed out that because mind-body dualism privileges the mind over the body and thereby disregards the world and disregards our body, introduces some very negative and oppressive, for lack of a better term, notions into philosophy, and that we as philosophers should intervene into the world to try to think critically about it in order that we may change it, in order that we may transform it and aid those who are already engaging in processes to change it for the better, to change it to make a better world, whether that's in politics, whether that's in science, or other domains as well, like such as art, for example, or even ethics. It's not something we've really talked about. Okay, so that concludes the critique of mind-body dualism, but we'll see that dualism again and again emerging in philosophical debates of all sorts. Okay, that's all I have for today.